Stop running. That pain chasing you isn't a mistake. It's a call to come home. You learn to be strong by denying the part of you that feels, to be spiritual by denying the part that screams, to be functional by denying the part that collapses. But the soul doesn't negotiate with lies. It freezes. It implodes. It pulls the ground from under you when you insist on floating. Carl Jung already knew, as long as you reject the part that scares you, you reject the only part that can truly heal you. You call it anxiety, call it exhaustion, call it, I don't know who I am anymore. But deep down, you do. You just don't want to look. Because you know that if you look, everything changes. You've spent your life trying to get better. But maybe you've never stopped to ask, better for whom? To be accepted, to fit in, to stay useful. The ego lives on appearances. But the soul only blooms when you stop pretending you can keep surviving in pieces. This video isn't advice, it's a mirror. And maybe it's the cut you've been needing. From the very beginning of life, an invisible program starts being installed in every human being. No one asks how you feel, how you see the world, how you dream. The world just hands you a manual, silent, implicit, but demanding. You learn early on that there's a right way to exist, and any deviation must be corrected. Sensitive children are called fragile. Dreamers are seen as distracted. The introspective ones get labeled as weird. Carl Jung once said, "The ego isn't born ready. It's shaped to survive." And in trying to fit in, you start silencing entire parts of yourself. Spirituality becomes weakness, intuition becomes suspicion, emotion becomes shame. And fear isn't shown. It's swallowed with a smile, as if it weren't rotting you from the inside. The problem is that adaptation comes at too high a price, the paralysis of the soul. When someone is forced to live behind a persona that doesn't match their inner archetypes, something inside starts to die in silence. And it's a confusing kind of grief, because the world applauds your performance while you feel like you're fading. That's when the calling begins. But it doesn't come in clear words. It comes as restlessness, unexplained exhaustion, a nameless dissatisfaction. It's when everything seems fine, but it isn't, and you don't know why. That calling is your soul pulling you back. Not to who you're supposed to be, but to who you are, before you learn to hide. The cruelest part. The world teaches you to confuse performance with identity. You get used to being praised for roles that aren't yours. An intuitive pretending to be a sensor, a sensitive soul acting logical, a creative stuck in a mechanical routine. Over time, you start believing that performance is you, but all it takes is a moment of silence, a pause from the noise, for the truth to slip through the cracks. Jung called this an archetypal rupture. It's when the ego starts to crack, and the unconscious takes advantage of the gap to whisper, everything you built, is it real or just survival? And if you're brave enough to listen, you'll start to see the fear that drives you and the power it hides. And maybe this is the turning point no one ever told you about. Deep spirituality doesn't begin with peace. It begins with collapse, with the breakdown of a borrowed identity, with the confrontation between the authentic self and the social character. Shadow work isn't about healing. It's about tearing off the mask, tearing up the script that was written for you. And when that calling hits, it doesn't ask permission. It paralyzes everything that used to give you meaning. Work loses color, relationships grow loud, routine becomes a cage, and suddenly you're stuck there, motionless, pressed against the corner of your own life, with fear that paralyzes, but also with an intuition that whispers, there's more than this. And it's in that whisper that the next chapter starts to take shape. No one chooses their own mask. It's handed to you in the crib. Before you even have words to reject it, It comes wrapped in looks, corrections, and selective praise. A social archetype projected onto you, dictating who you can be, and more importantly, who you can't. Carl Jung called this the formation of the persona, the creation of a self that adapts to survive its environment but drifts dangerously far from the true self. And the cruelest part? The better the mask works, the further you drift from yourself. You begin to confuse approval with love, performance with worth, obedience with identity. At this stage, the ego doesn't grow. It deforms. It learns to hide behind roles, and what's left inside is a smiling void. Most people never realize what happened. They go on convinced they are who the world rewarded them for being. The shy one became trustworthy. The rebel turned into a problem. The sensitive one was labeled inconvenient. And no one stopped to ask, what if this behavior is just a defense? Shadow work begins right there, in the discomfort that rises when you realize that much of what you do isn't driven by choice, but by fear. Fear of rejection, fear of not belonging, fear of not being enough. This emotional paralysis forces you to keep repeating the same role, even when it drains you. And even if something inside you is screaming for change, your conditioning shouts louder, don't go off script, or you'll be punished. That punishment doesn't come from the outside, it comes from within, from a fragmented psyche that learned to survive by denying its own essence. How many times have you caught yourself being yourself and still felt like you were acting? There's a limit to how much performance a soul can endure, and once you pass that limit, the body starts to signal. Identity crises, random anxiety, a deep feeling of being disconnected from your own life. It's the unconscious sending warnings, trying to rise from the depths it was pushed into. Jung said, everything that is not brought to consciousness returns as fate. And maybe your fate today is just the unconscious repetition of a mask you never chose. Spirituality isn't about ascending, it's about descending, about having the courage to go down into the depths where that mask was forged. And finally, face the pain of seeing yourself without it, raw, bare, real. And here comes the painful break. Even after realizing you're living a borrowed persona, part of you still wants to keep it. Why? Because the ego is terrified of dying, and it will use any argument to keep you tied to that role. It'll call you ungrateful, dramatic, selfish for questioning the structure. But real selfishness is living your whole life denying your soul, just to uphold an image that gets applause. That's where shadow work stops being pretty and starts getting brutal, because it rips off every layer of your false identity, one by one, until you face the question you've always avoided. Who am I when no one's watching? And the answer may not come in words, but it always comes with rupture. You don't see the world as it is, you see the world as you are. And that way of seeing isn't random. It's built on an invisible but defining psychic structure. Carl Jung called this psychological functions, 4 fundamental ways of processing reality, the 4 portals of the mind: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. Each of us is born with one dominant, and that changes everything. It changes what you value. It changes what hurts you. It changes what makes you feel alive. The problem is, almost no one knows their dominant function because it was suppressed early on by what the world saw as more useful or acceptable. So you grew up feeling like there was something wrong with how you think, react, or feel, but the error was never yours. It was the disconnect. A thinker, when raised in an emotionally chaotic environment, may become cold just to survive. A feeler, raised in a hyperlogical setting, learns to stay silent, as if their emotions were a burden. An intuitive, who sees beyond the obvious, may be labeled as distracted, unstable, or disconnected. A sensor, who lives grounded in the present, might feel slow in the abstract speed of others. Look closely. No one is right or wrong. These are just different ways of moving through life. But when you try to operate through a portal that's not yours, you jam. The mind goes into conflict, the body tires, the soul dims, and the ego clings to the mask, pretending everything's fine. But it's not. It's like wearing a lens that doesn't fit your vision. Everything blurs, confuses, exhausts. Shadow work at this point is like dismantling the architecture and rebuilding the foundation. It's looking honestly and asking, how do I really operate? Are you driven by logic or by values, by presence or by future visions? Do you seek security or meaning? Knowing your dominant portal isn't a label. It's liberation. It's like, for the first time, you stop fighting your inner current. And suddenly things start to make sense. The choices you never understood, the relationships that drained you, the places where your soul screamed, I don't belong. It all starts to align once you discover which function leads your mind and which ones you've been rejecting. Because what's paralyzing you today might not be a lack of strength. It might just be too much effort in the wrong direction. And here's the part no one tells you. Your dominant function is your gift, but it can also be your prison. Because if you cling too tightly to it without integrating the others, you become incomplete, functional, but fragmented. Jung said, individuation begins when we not only recognize our strengths, but also face the parts we avoid. And avoiding is easy. We run from what we don't master. The thinker avoids emotion. The feeler avoids conflict. The intuitive avoids grounding. The sensor avoids the unknown. But what you avoid is exactly what you need to integrate. The portals aren't walls, they're doors. And the spiritual journey only begins when you choose to walk through the one that scares you most. You're not just what you know about yourself, you're also everything you hide, avoid, deny, and yet still drives you. Carl Jung called this hidden set of psychic content the unconscious, and that's where both your greatest powers and your trickiest ghosts live. Most people think they live consciously, but they're on autopilot, following impulses they don't understand, driven by traumas they barely remember. In this play, the ego acts like the lead, but it's really just a manager trying to run a company whose files are all locked in the basement. And down there is where the danger lives, because what you don't know about yourself runs your life in the subtext, and the more you reject it, the stronger it gets. The shadow, a central concept in shadow work, is the unseen face of your psyche. Everything that was repressed, criticized, judged, or hidden since childhood. The jealousy you pretend you don't have, the anger you mask as humor, the vanity you condemn in others, the need for control you label as being organized. None of it is evil, it's human. But when you push it into the dark, you don't erase it, you feed it. And what grows in the dark grows deformed. Spirituality isn't about lighting the path. It's about lighting the basement. The fear that paralyzes you isn't in the future. It's in the things you still refuse to face in the mirror. And the most dangerous part? What you repress, you project. You'll start hating in others what you've tried to bury in yourself. Picture someone who prides themselves on being 100% rational. Cold, logical, objective. The type who mocks emotion, dismisses intuition, and scoffs at sensitivity. Looks like strength, but often it's just escape. Jung taught that behind every extreme behavior is an unconscious compensation. Maybe that coldness is just a wall hiding a sensitivity that was never welcomed. Maybe that over-the-top logic is the shield of someone once ridiculed for feeling too much. In that case, the ego protects, but also imprisons, because the truth is, the part you hide is the same one that sabotages you. What you don't integrate leaks into your relationships, decisions, and cycles. And no matter how hard you try to rationalize it, the ghost always comes back. But the ghost isn't here to destroy you, it's here to wake you up. Every self-sabotage, every pattern that repeats, every emotional shutdown that hits when everything seemed fine, is just the shadow saying, look at me, And that look changes everything, because the moment you acknowledge the shadow, it stops controlling you. It doesn't disappear, but it loses its power in the dark. Carl Jung said true transformation only begins when consciousness embraces the shadow, not as an enemy, but as a rightful part of the psyche. The impulse that drives you can be the same one that destroys you if you don't know where it's coming from. But if you have the courage to descend, to see, to feel, to confront, a new strength begins to rise. A real one. One that doesn't come from denial, but from integration. There's a part of you that's always felt strange, like it didn't belong. A tendency, an emotion, a reaction that shows up uninvited, and that you've learned to judge, suppress, or just ignore. Maybe you're someone logical, but every now and then a wave of inexplicable sensitivity takes over. Maybe you're practical, but deep down, there's a quiet intuition showing you paths you don't want to see. Carl Jung called this the inferior function, the least developed, least accepted, least understood part of the psyche. And for that very reason, it's the most powerful when awakened. It's not a flaw, it's the missing piece, what you excluded for being uncomfortable, unnecessary, or wrong, but now screams in silence to be embraced. This foreign body in your psyche isn't an intruder. It's a rightful part of who you are. But since you never learned to deal with it, it shows up in distorted ways. A thinker who breaks down emotionally in silent crises. A feeler who retreats into logic to avoid feeling. An intuitive who freezes when faced with reality. A sensor who panics when things go off script. These dysfunctions are clues. They don't show weakness. They reveal what's calling for balance. And this is where shadow work stops being just analysis and turns into alchemy. Integrating the inferior function is like welcoming a child you've always rejected. It's not easy. That child will resist, challenge you, mess up everything you thought was neat. But without it, you'll never be whole. You'll live functional but fractured. The ego hates this idea. It'll tell you this strange part will make you weaker, expose you, tear you apart. And it's true, it will. But what it won't say is that this unraveling is where healing begins. Real spirituality isn't about floating above your conflicts, it's about diving into them with eyes open. When you get close to your inferior function, your view of the world expands. You start to see beyond the narrow lens you used just to survive. Carl Jung said the process of individuation demands this confrontation. Not just developing what you're good at, but maturing what you've always avoided. The weak part, when integrated, becomes your support beam. And the strong part, when it accepts its limits, becomes more human. So take a sincere look. What part of you was labeled as inappropriate, too much, childish, or useless? That's where the treasure lives. Maybe it's your ability to feel, your anger, your imagination, your intensity. Your fear, yes, even fear, might be part of your inferior function, and it paralyzes you not because it's the enemy, but because it hasn't been allowed to exist with dignity. Integrating this part is uncomfortable, yes. It's like hosting a visitor you've rejected your whole life. But when that visitor finally sits at your table, something shifts. The psyche begins to reorganize. Chaos turns into coherence. And what used to be internal noise becomes music. A strange song, maybe. But finally, your own. You don't hate certain people by accident. You're not bothered by certain behaviors by chance. What irritates you in others often reveals something you don't want to see in yourself. Jung called this projection of the shadow. It's when what you reject inside starts showing up outside, mirrored in friends, partners, family, co-workers. And the impulse is always the same: point, criticize, push away. But true spirituality, the kind that's not about performance but confrontation, teaches that anything triggering a strong emotional reaction in you carries a part of yourself that hasn't yet been welcomed. The shadow, as uncomfortable as it may seem, isn't a punishment. It's a messenger. It reveals what's been hidden, and what's hidden still controls you. Think about the archetypes you avoid: the aggressive, the seductive, the messy, the vulnerable. Maybe you were taught that those aspects were ugly, wrong, dangerous, so you shoved them under the rug. But the psyche doesn't tolerate amputations. It collects the debt, and it charges interest. You might pretend you've outgrown it, that you're evolved, that you don't feel anger, jealousy, envy, neediness, but your body knows. Your unconscious knows. And when you least expect it, what you denied shows up. In a passive-aggressive remark, in self-sabotage, in a destructive relationship. Emotional paralysis begins right here, when you try to live with only the pretty parts of your psyche and refuse to see the full reflection. The ego, of course, will resist, because looking at your shadow means stepping down from the pedestal your persona built, and it hurts. You'll have to admit you're not as good as you thought, that you're also selfish, controlling, insecure, needy. But that's the turning point, because spirituality isn't made of light, it's made of truth. And truth heals. Shadow work, when done with courage, brings a kind of freedom you can't get through meditation or inspiring quotes. It's born from shock, from the realization that even your nice behaviors might be emotional manipulation, that even your generosity might hide a need for control, that even your silence might be a weapon. The shadow doesn't forgive, but it doesn't lie either. Want to start seeing your shadow? Pay attention to the criticisms you repeat, the people you judge most harshly, the situations that always put you on the defensive. That's your mirror. That's the part of you that needs to be integrated. Carl Jung said that what you deny enslaves you, but what you acknowledge sets you free. And that freedom isn't theoretical, it's practical. It changes your relationships, brings inner peace, relaxes your body, dissolves paralysis. Because once you embrace your shadow, you stop fighting yourself. And in the space that opens, something rare emerges: integrity. Not in the moral sense, but in the sense of wholeness. A complete, real human being who no longer needs to hide their truth to deserve existence. You think you're in control. You think you're choosing your path, your words, your relationships, your reactions. But what if all that's just an illusion? What if most of your choices are made by you, but without you? Carl Jung said the unconscious isn't just a storage of forgotten memories. It's a living force, shaping behaviors, repeating patterns, drawing in experiences so you can see yourself. Deep spirituality begins when you realize that most of what you call free will is actually conditioning. It's the ego wearing autonomy, the persona pretending to be mature. But throw in a crisis, a loss, an emotional trigger, and you act exactly as you always have, without knowing why. That's the unconscious theater at work. The ego loves control because it fears chaos. It wants to predict, plan, dominate. But the unconscious moves like a silent tide, always finding a way to rise, repress emotions, and they show up as physical pain. Avoid traumas, and they return in relationship patterns. Reject parts of yourself, and they reappear in the people you criticize the most. Fear, when ignored, becomes paralysis, and paralysis becomes destiny. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That's not poetry. It's a warning, because as long as you believe your conscious mind is all there is, you'll keep being played by forces within that you don't even recognize. Watch how this shows up in your everyday life. You say you want change, but repeat the same behaviors. Swear you won't tolerate certain things, then go back to them. Claim you're different, yet attract the same relationships that hurt you. That's not stupidity, not weakness. That's the unconscious pulling the strings behind the curtain. And the more you try to control without investigating, the more stuck you become. Because the ego rules the surface, but the soul rules the depths. And if those depths are abandoned, you live like a castaway rowing with one arm. Shadow work at this point is the map that shows you where the other half of the oar is. Not to give you certainty, but to finally give you direction. Real spirituality doesn't give you more control. It teaches you to surrender false control and take responsibility instead. Because there's a huge difference between control and awareness. The first is fear disguised as strength. The second is presence. A conscious person doesn't need to predict everything because they know themselves. They know where they slip. They recognize their triggers. They feel when the shadow wants to take over, and instead of suppressing it, they listen. This is the psychic maturity Jung called individuation, when the ego stops thinking it's the king and learns to partner with the unconscious, not to be sure of everything, but to live with truth. And maybe, just maybe, that's the truth you've been avoiding for far too long. You were trained to pick sides. You're either rational or emotional, strong or sensitive, practical or spiritual. This dualistic thinking was the culture's way of categorizing the human being, but also the most effective way of tearing us apart from within. Carl Jung saw this division as a tragic split between the powers of the soul. He said individuation only begins when we stop living as halves. Emotion and logic aren't enemies, they're complementary forces. But when you reject one, you create an internal abyss. And that abyss fragments you. The ego then clings to the dominant function and tries to suffocate the other. The result? A warrior collapsing in silence, a sensitive soul drowning inside, an intuitive who never brings anything to life, a sensor who lives grounded but never sees the sky. Think about it. How many times has your logic stopped you from feeling? How many times has your emotion sabotaged your ability to decide? You don't need to keep choosing between them. You need to learn how to listen. The problem is that the ego is terrified of losing control if it listens to the part it's been denying for years. Logic fears the instability of emotion. Emotion distrusts the coldness of logic. But the conflict only exists because you're still living inside the persona, which wants to keep the character consistent. Shadow work begins to heal this fight when you allow yourself to realize that feeling isn't weakness, thinking isn't coldness, acting isn't impulsiveness, and silence isn't passivity. It all depends on who's in charge, fear or awareness. In practice, this means learning how to pause in the middle of a reaction. When you're about to explode emotionally, stop and ask, is this old pain or is it really about now? When you're about to make a cold, logical decision, ask, does this honor my values or am I just running from pain? Jung didn't want you to eliminate parts of yourself. He wanted you to have a dialogue with them, like a conductor who understands the timing of each instrument without forcing the violin to sound like a drum. That harmony only happens when the unconscious starts to be heard. Deep spirituality doesn't silence the opposites, it makes them dance. And when they dance, you begin to act with precision, speak with clarity, feel with integrity. And that is power. Most people don't live like this. They're always leaning too far to one side, trying to compensate for the other. A psychic imbalance dressed up as personality. But the soul feels it, and it calls you out. Sometimes with anxiety, sometimes with paralysis, sometimes with physical symptoms that medicine can't explain. This inner dance between reason and emotion isn't optional. It's going to happen. The only question is, will you lead or be dragged? The ego will try to avoid integration because it means dropping the act, but the self longs for this union because it's exactly in that place of tension between opposites that something new is born. Something that's not logic or emotion, but consciousness. The world reduced Jung to Instagram quotes. They took one of the deepest explorers of the human soul and turned him into pretty but hollow sayings. The psychology he brought wasn't about finding labels. It was about freeing the being from what the world imposed on them. Carl Jung didn't want you to know your type. He wanted you to see where your soul got sick, to recognize the ego you protect as if it were your identity, the persona you defend as if it were your essence. He saw spirituality as a brutal process of peeling away layers until you reach the core. And that core is rarely comfortable. Freedom begins when truth makes you uncomfortable. When you look at yourself and realize half your life was spent trying to please people who never saw your soul. Personality tests, MBTI profiles, commercialized archetypes, all of it can be helpful, but it can also trap you. Because when you use those tools to justify instead of expand, you lose the essence of what Jung wanted to give you. He said the psyche is dynamic, that consciousness is a flowing process, and that the danger lies in identifying too deeply with any role, even the one that seems spiritually awakened. The ego is a master at dressing up in the clothes of evolution while keeping the soul locked in old patterns. That's why shadow work never really ends, because the shadow keeps shifting. And the freedom you claim today can become a prison tomorrow if you stop looking inward. True spiritual psychology is a constant call to inner vigilance. Most people want healing without tearing, awareness without rupture, spirituality without confrontation. But Jung knew that was a lie. That there's no true enlightenment without first passing through the hell of self-knowledge. And that hell has a name. Fear. Fear of seeing yourself. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of realizing that the you've been defending so proudly was just a social construction, a defense, a functional illusion. The paralysis you feel isn't because you're weak, it's because you're ready. Ready to see, ready to drop the act, ready to integrate the truth. Jungian psychology doesn't want to put you in a new box. It wants to destroy all of them and then watch you, naked, stripped of persona, to see if you still have the courage to exist. Because that's where individuation begins, when you realize the world that shaped you no longer has power over you, when you no longer live to prove anything, when you stop following external archetypes and begin listening to the ones already vibrating inside your soul. And ironically, it's only then that true strength begins to emerge, not the strength to win, but the strength to be, to stand whole even while fractured, to move forward even while shaking, to love even while wounded. What Jung really meant is that you don't need to be healed to deserve existence. You just need the courage to never abandon yourself again. And that may be the most spiritual act a human being can perform in this life. Few make it through. Most stop halfway. Because individuation isn't about improvement, it's about death. Not physical death, but symbolic. It's the collapse of your image, the end of your character, the fall of the ego that's long directed your inner theater. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the birth of the self after the dissolution of the persona. But that birth doesn't happen in the light. It happens in the dark. In that exact moment when you look in the mirror and say, everything I thought I was, maybe I never truly was. There's no glory in that moment. There's silence, there's grief, there's fear. A fear that paralyzes because you no longer know who you are, and yet you can't keep pretending to be who you were. The crossing begins when you stop running, when you agree to descend into the basement of your soul and face what lives down there. Your inherited beliefs, your buried desires, your accumulated rage, your abandoned sensitivity, everything the world didn't know how to hold, and that you, in order to survive, learned to hide. Shadow work now becomes a ritual of integration. You're no longer just analyzing your parts, you're embracing them, letting them become part of your new structure. And that takes courage, because contrary to what they told you, being whole isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. It's allowing both light and shadow to live in the same temple, letting love coexist with limits, letting spirituality be lived in the body, not just in the mind. Individuation is the point where spirituality stops being an escape and becomes grounding. You no longer need to fake light all the time. You no longer need to recite pretty phrases while you're falling apart inside. You learn to hold the paradox. You learn that you can be intense and calm, strong and vulnerable, clear and confused. You learn that you can feel fear and still keep walking, because the self doesn't demand perfection. It demands presence. Jung said the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that means breaking away from everything you thought you had to be. And that rupture hurts. It hurts because it involves letting go of people, of places, of routines, of stories. It involves dying to what is shallow so you can be reborn into what is real. And that's when the paralysis begins to fade. Not because everything is resolved, but because you've stopped running from yourself. Fear doesn't disappear, but now it has a name. And when something has a name, it's no longer a ghost. The ego is no longer the enemy. The persona is no longer a prison. They become allies as long as they know their place. And the self begins to lead with silent strength. This is the soul's final right. A crossing with no map, no promise of reward, but one that holds meaning, deep, alive, and only accessible to those who've decided to stop hiding. Because in the end, true spirituality isn't about escaping pain. It's about having the courage to walk through it and come out the other side with your soul whole. You've spent this whole video looking inward. Now tell me, are you really going to keep pretending you didn't see it? You know where it hurts. You know what paralyzes you. You know your soul can't take being pushed into the dark anymore. The question isn't whether you understood, it's whether you'll do something about what you felt. What part of you is begging to be seen? What rejected fragment is pleading to come home? What do you still call a weakness that deep down you already know is power? Carl Jung said the greatest tragedy is to live your whole life without ever becoming who you are. So, what's stopping you? If something in this video hit you, write. Doesn't matter if it's messy, small, or shapeless. Sometimes the comment is just the first cut back to the soul. And if you want to keep peeling back the layers that hold you back, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell, because here we don't put band-aids on the soul. We look and we walk through it.